I think that, okay, so defining child early and forced marriage is very important because we actually are talking about many different demographics of girls, young people, and adolescents, right? And sometimes people use the terms interchangeably, but this is not like advisable because we have to identify the vulnerabilities that different groups face. One of the critical differences that you will often find is that in many cultures that child marriage is, an adolescent transitions from being a child to a woman when she first starts menstruating. So in their culture, they're no longer considered children, although under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, their definition is still a child, but in their culture, they already consider women. So which is why early marriage is also something that you need to consider as per the definition of the Convention against the Rights for the Rights of the Child. Okay, and so we also have to look at the life cycle approach when we're talking about adolescents and girls. And it's shocking to think that many women in the world, 700 million according to UNICEF, 700 million were married before they were 18 years of age, and about 250 million of those were married before 15 years of age. This is a very, very large number, okay? One of the systemic root causes, right, that are beyond poverty. So generally we think that poverty and lack of access to education is what forces families to marry off their daughters earlier. So, and these are well-known causes, of course, and they're more easily tackled, perhaps, poverty and limited access to quality education and those living in rural areas. So this is why they think that the practice of child early and forced marriage happens. However, we also need to look at ingrained patriarchy together with narrow religious, cultural, and traditional interpretations of gender equality and women's position within the family and society further the practice. And it was quite shocking for us because although I come from a regional organization that works across 17 countries, I actually come from a country like Malaysia, and Malaysia has been a very developed, progressive country for many, many years now. And we actually have a higher rate of development than most countries. We have reduced poverty, and one of those strategies was actually providing universal access to education. So we actually, the whole country has access to education which is free, right? And of course, because we're a small population, 26 million, so it was able to provide that. However, recent statistics, and this just emerged out of the blue, right? Not out of the blue, but through like some particular reports and particular census. There was actually, suddenly we found there were 2,000, 3,000 girls getting married every year below the age of 15. So if you have something, and this is what we go and tell governments, isn't it? We said, if you provide universal access to education for girls and you give incentives for parents to send girls to schools, then this practice of CEFM will cease slowly, right? And yet, this is a very interesting dichotomy that's coming up because you have this, and yet you have this practice. We also had, and of course, when the women's rights NGOs found out about it, because we never thought it was happening in our country, right? But when the women's rights NGOs found out about it, and then they went to do their advocacy, you're not going to believe what the government did. So they took out the age bracket. So now, if you see the latest census, you cannot identify how many were married before the age of 18. So and then they had another thing because under UNAIDS they reported how many people were tested for HIV. Then we had like large numbers of young girls who were tested for HIV below the age of 18 because actually they were going to get married, and so they have compulsory HIV testing, especially for Muslim couples. So they captured those numbers. So that was another evidence for us that this practice is continuing. Wow. Now, sorry. Okay. So what? I think Mr. Mbinge has already said quite a bit about SRHR. I would like to extend a little bit. So child early and forced marriage, limits girls and young women's SRHR in many ways. It poses physical and psychological health implications. It affects the reproductive health and rights of girls. They are more vulnerable to early pregnancy, as you have also pointed out, and related complications, because early pregnancies, I mean younger ages, and you can die during the childbirth. You could have morbidities like fistula, and their bodies are not physically prepared to have children. I think some other data by WHO and all also help tell that younger women in marriages are actually more vulnerable to violence, which is something that you've also brought up. So I think these are all the aspects of reproductive health which are very important. But we must also while there is a health impact, we must also understand that CAFM really infringes on the reproductive rights of girls and adolescents. Right? Girls are not empowered to make decisions within their relationships, including with their bodies, lack access to accurate information about their sexual and reproductive health, including contraception, availability, access and use to all other reproductive health services, including the access to safe abortion services as well. So their sexual health and rights are also limited. They're unable to express their sexuality and make free and informed decisions related to who they enter into relationship with, and whether they want to have sex or not. And their sexual health is also undermined with the inability to be protected from violence and to access information and services and STI protection. Okay. So it also limits the bodily integrity and enjoyment of childhood. I mean, we all wish we were back there, right? And we can't go back. So, so what are the legal limitations and lack of enforcement? So culturally and socially, we know that in many societies that girls are considered to be under the guardianship of their fathers, and this guardianship passes on to the husband after they are married, right? So they're not actually considered as a person in their own right. They're always taken care of by others. I think this also frames, where their rights come from, or whether they have rights, or what type of rights they have. And the legislation on the minimum age of marriage is very rarely enforced, especially in those countries that we know in South Asia, because Bangladesh, India, because firstly, of course, there's an inavailability of the birth registration system. So when you're getting married, people don't know how old you are, or there's not a marriage registration system. So even if the law has, for example, in Bangladesh, a minimum age of marriage, there is no enforcement of this minimum age of marriage. It means nothing. Ironically, in Bangladesh, the age of consent is 14. So it's only if you marry below 14, you could be charged with statutory rape, but however, I don't think that's enforced either. Okay. And in many of our countries, what we do have is multiple legal systems. Right? So we may have a secular and civil legal system that has issues such as statutory rape, has got early age of minimum age of marriage is enforced, and but there are some systems who, of course, take into consideration customary and cultural and religious practices. So when they do that, then you have a kind of conflict between these two, because at one point a girl and a woman, I mean, we are a citizen of the country, but where we have access to recourse to justice, we have to then divide which court do we face, right? So I think that so this is a very important thing we need to tackle when we are talking about helping reduce child early and forced marriage. So I think that the only last point I want to make is, so in addition to that, we also found that, we are seeing today increasing conflict. We're also seeing climate change and disasters. And there is evidence to prove that in times of emergency occurrences, that what happens is there is a tendency to marry off girls earlier. And, our research in Bangladesh says that after Cyclone Sidr and Ayla, that there were families actually married because they were additionally impoverished. So they decided to then, marry off their girls earlier. So this is just some thoughts that I can give you. I have some more, but my time is up.